The Atlas is now Volkswagen's second best-selling model in America, and for 2024, it's received a pretty major refresh. They gave it sharper looks on the outside and a more modern interior. But it hasn't lost what Volkswagen shoppers have really loved about this big and boxy three-row SUV, and that's that it's big and it's boxy. But there are a lot of really great three-row SUVs in America, so exactly how does the Atlas stack up? What's going on under the hood? That is a bit of a controversial change for 2024. And does this deserve to be a bit higher on the sales charts? Interestingly, for 2023, this managed to finish 9th or 10th, depending on exactly how you count the category in terms of sales. I'm sure you've heard the phrase before, the consumer benefits when there's competition. Well, there is perhaps no more competitive segment in America than the three-row SUV segment where the Atlas competes. There are big ones, little ones, expensive ones, hybrids, plug-in hybrids, and even electric options as well. Volkswagen decided to differentiate the Atlas in a few different ways. First, by its looks. You can see we have a new, sharper design with this sort of a 4 or 5 bar Gillette-style grille up front, big illuminated Volkswagen logo so that way you know exactly what's in your rearview mirror, and this big light bar that connects the LED headlights from one side to the other. These are some of the best LED headlights in this segment. We have standard LEDs, standard adaptive headlights, so they swivel in the corners, and rather than fog lights separate down below, we have something that we've seen from Volkswagen before, which is their all-weather light. It's actually a small module inside each of these headlamps that shines light sort of down and to the side of the vehicle. A little bit different than the average fog light. It's a little bit more discreet, and I find it actually more useful for country driving. Since this is a refresh, not a redesign, the general dimensions and general proportions remain about the same. We have that big boxy back end, which gives us excellent third-row headroom and solid cargo capacity behind, and it's still just under 201 inches long. At one point, that put the Atlas on the long side of the three-row mid-size SUV segment, which is quite a mouthful. But now we have options that are longer than this. We have the new Grand Highlander, which is a few inches longer and has a huge, huge third row. We of course have the Grand Cherokee L and the new GMC Acadia and new Traverse, which are going to be on sale shortly. Those are going to be a little bit longer and give us a bit more cargo capacity behind. One of the confusing specifications is the ground clearance on the Atlas. VW says this now has 6.3 inches of ground clearance, which is about an inch less than last year, but nothing structurally has changed under the body or in terms of the suspension design. So ground clearance is logically basically the same. They're probably just measuring from a different location underneath the body in order to be conservative. However, you will find greater ground clearance in a decent number of options. The benefit to the Atlas shopper is that the floorboards, the entry point to the vehicle, is going to be lower. So stepping in is going to be a lot easier for kids or shorter adults as well. Off-road trims are all the rage these days, so of course Volkswagen gives us one in the new Peak edition of the Atlas, but it's worth noting that that does not give you any extra ground clearance. It does, however, give you more off-road oriented tires, and I think a style that's a bit more pleasing to my eye. Volkswagen's designers definitely go for the same sausage, different lengths school of design, and you know, I think that's just fine. The Atlas is one of the most attractive entries in this segment, at least to my eye, and I love the fact that we get full LEDs front and rear in all trims and amber turn signals in the back as well. The one thing I don't like, however, is something that we find in a lot of Volkswagen models, which is these absolutely fake exhaust tips down here at the bottom. These are really just chrome rings pressed into the bumper. The actual exhaust tips are down there under the bumper, and yes, it does have 2 exits to that muffler in the rear, but nothing is actually going through these chrome ovals here. In the middle of everything, we have a 2-inch hitch receiver, and you'll find 2,000 pounds of towing capacity standard in the Atlas, 5,000 pounds in most trims, however. The most distinctive thing about the back end has to be this illuminated Volkswagen logo in the middle of the light bar. We see a lot of illuminated logos on the front of new cars for 2024, but not too many in the taillights. Now for the controversial part. The Atlas features one of the smallest and least powerful engines in this segment. That's because the VR6 is no longer available. In its place, all trims are going to have a 2-liter 4-cylinder turbo. It produces 269 horsepower, 273 pound-feet of torque. That is a little bit more power than we find in the Grand Highlander. It produces 265 horsepower, but thanks to its larger displacement, about 2.4 liters on that turbo, it produces 310 pound-feet of torque, so definitely more than we find out of this 2-liter turbo. This is mated to an 8-speed automatic transmission and your choice of front-wheel drive or all-wheel drive. I would like to tell you that the trade-off for this smaller displacement turbo is improved fuel economy, but the fuel economy is actually on the slightly below average side of things. You'll get between 20 and 23 miles per gallon depending on the trim level you get. At least towing capacity is right up there with everybody else, 5,000 pounds in most trims, like the model that we're looking at here. I know I keep saying the Atlas is boxy, but that is a big feature of this vehicle. Not only does it make the interior actually roomier, it makes it feel roomier as well. I'm 6 feet tall. If I have this seat all the way down on the ground, I have maybe 3.5 inches of headroom left. This does have the panoramic moonroof, and that means that if I really wanted to sit very, very upright in the driver's seat, I could definitely do that and have certainly much more of a big SUV feel behind the wheel. Also, it allows us to give a lot of room back there to the second row seats. On the downside, we only have two-way adjustable lumbar support even in this SEL trim, and I really would have liked to have seen Volkswagen give us a slightly more adjustable driver's seat. We do, however, have a 3-position memory over here and a tilt telescopic steering column with a pretty decent range of motion. I'm going to give these front seats 9 out of 10 points when it comes to the comfort score. I find the design of these seats intrinsically very comfortable, especially on longer highway trips, but you should know that the passenger seat does not have any kind of adjustable lumbar support. At the start of the video, I told you this was one of the most family-friendly options in the segment, and here's why. Not only do we get lots of room, I have maybe about 4 inches of clearance between this rear-facing infant seat and the driver's seat comfortably adjusted for me at 6 feet tall, we also have one of the few entries in this segment with a novel motion to the second row seats. If I take this seat out, you can see the practicality here. This seat tilts and slides forward while certain child seats, base stations, or booster seats are latch anchored into place. So for this infant seat, for instance, I can have this carrier latch anchored onto the seat as long as I'm not using the foot. Of course, that's part of this particular Kleck seat. Seats with anti-rebound bars, those would work well, etc. And you can then easily access the third row. This is not something you can do in a Highlander, a Grand Highlander, a Pilot, Telluride, Palisade, etc., etc., etc. But it is something that we find in a few options, like the Grand Cherokee L, the Acadia, the Traverse for 2024. It's a really, really handy feature. It makes getting kids in and out of the vehicle or adults in and out of the back very, very simple. Now, on the other hand, we don't have quite as much legroom as we'll find in a Grand Highlander. We do, however, have plenty. So again, with this front seat comfortably just 6 feet tall, I have easily over 6 inches of legroom left, and you can slide this second row seat forward and backward to give the folks in the way back more room. Also, plenty of headroom, about 2 inches or so right here in this model. The Atlas is available as either a 6-seat or a 7-seat vehicle. That has always struck me a little funny, because the third row, I would love the option if there was a 3-person third row back there, but that's not something we find. You either get captain's chairs here in the middle, this is the option that we have in this model, or you'll have a 3-person bench. Now, it is worth noting that even if you get the 3-person bench, the seats still move in this fashion so you can leave a child seat anchored into place. If you want to take an even deeper dive into child seats and the Atlas, be sure and click the link down there in the description. I take a deep, deep dive in a separate video. This seat design definitely makes getting into the third row easy, regardless of what you may or may not have in the second row. And that makes this very different than something like the Grand Highlander or the Pilot, because in those vehicles, all you could do with the child seat is scoot them forward and try and scurry through this really tiny gap over here between the second row seat and the side of the door. It's definitely not easy to get into the third row in those vehicles if you have a child seat like this in this position. Now, this vehicle is not unique. You will find this feature in a number of the competitors, but oddly enough, not the best sellers in the segment, like the Highlander, the Telluride, the Palisade Pilot, etc., or the Ford Explorer. Back here in the third row, we have a lot of room. Legroom, not quite as much as the Grand Highlander. You can see I have maybe 1/2 inch, 3/4 of an inch of legroom left there. However, the second row seat could be slid a little bit further forward, for instance like that, giving me maybe about 2 inches of legroom, and I could very comfortably sit up front, in the second row, and back here in the third row. There are slight variations in the way that companies measure legroom. You should know that even though the number in the Telluride is notably larger than this, as far as feel on the inside, it's substantially similar to that, and definitely roomier than something like the Highlander. especially when it comes to third row headroom. Sitting here in a very natural position, I have over an inch of headroom left. If I put my head all the way back there to the head restraint, then my head is touching the ceiling right there around the hinge area for the hatch. But sitting in a position that most people would be sitting in, the third row is surprisingly comfortable for adults. And the seat bottom cushion is not slammed all the way to the ground. There are two trade-offs here, I guess. The lack of an eighth seat means that the outboard seating positions here in the third row are more comfortable than in something like a Highlander, but it also means it's a little bit less practical because we don't have that eighth seat belt, and that's something that I would like to see at least available as an option in the Atlas. We have some air vents back here on the side. They're well positioned to not only ventilate your face, but also your torso. And over there on the other side, we have two USB-C charge ports. No charge ports over here, but we do have cup holders on both sides and lots of hard plastic back here. Behind the power hatch, we find just over 20 cubic feet of cargo capacity. That's enough to put 4 of these 22-inch roller bags or 3 24-inch roller bags behind the third row. Obviously, you can also recline the third row to get even more storage space. You have to manually lower those headrests, and then it is a manual recline mechanism. If you're looking for a power folding third row seat, you want to look elsewhere, but if you're looking for something that's quick and easy to get those seats up and down, then you want to take a look at the Atlas. The power folding mechanisms add extra weight, they add extra complexity, and I'm actually bothered by the fact that they take a while to actually power move that seat, so I much prefer the manual seat design, honestly. Under the floor, we find some additional storage space, also the jack and tire iron, and then if we go further down the rabbit hole, we find the temporary spare tire. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that we are in the SEL trim, so you're going to find things in here that we don't find in the base model. But all versions have lots and lots of touch buttons. Not everybody's been a fan of that. We have touch buttons for the map lights, the dome lights. We have touch slider controls for the large panoramic moonroof. If I slide that one back, you can see that the full front pane opens. It actually opens almost completely, certainly giving you a much larger opening than we find, for instance, in the Mazda CX-90. And then that rear panel stretches all the way back there to just about the second row passengers' heads. Coming back up to the front, we find sun visors that slide forward and backward, height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger, and two-way adjustable headrests. The front seats feature surprisingly aggressive bolstering on the sides. That's something that I really appreciate, but if you want a seat that feels wide and roomy, you might want to look somewhere else. These are a bit more body-hugging. On the seat back and bottom cushion, we find perforations in the leather upholstery because these seats are both heated and ventilated. Moving over to the doors, we find a large storage cubby down there at the bottom of the door, some stitched materials in the midsection of the door, and really attractive imitation, I guess sort of stranded bamboo wood trim. This is not real wood trim, but I have to say Volkswagen has done an excellent job making it look and feel believable. It has kind of a rough texture, so that it feels a little bit more like open pore bamboo, kind of like bamboo flooring, really. Moving over to the dashboard, that bamboo continues all the way across the interior. I'm going to talk more about those vents on the driver's side, but inside this imitation wood trim, we actually have some of the ambient lighting treatment. It's difficult to see during the day, but Atlas is spelled out at night, and then there's some dots. I'll toss a picture in here so you can see what that looks like at night. And then underneath this black plastic strip, we find another ambient light strip around the dashboard, soft touch materials down below, and then a pretty big bin-style glove compartment. I had no problem fitting an 11-inch tablet computer inside. Let me know what you think about the wood trim treatment in here. I have to say I really like the way this dashboard looks, and I even like this sort of pop-up tablet computer infotainment system as far as the design and the look of it. You can see that that wood sort of spans behind that, really giving it a very floating on the dash appearance. Now, this system has been controversial. I don't know about the LCD placement, I don't mind that. What's been controversial is the lack of physical buttons. So lots of touch interface there. So you have the home button here that stays in place. Apple CarPlay or Android Auto uses that large section of the screen, reserving this side bit for climate control features. So I can press on that and take myself over to the climate control functions. But these sliders down here at the bottom, they're not illuminated. The power button is the only thing that lights up at night. So at night you're left groping for, wondering where the volume and temperature controls are. Of course, you have other ways of modifying the temperature. You can touch the screen up there. You can also voice command, etc. But it's not overly intuitive. Below that, we find two big air vents and more touch buttons. These take us over to some shortcuts in that system for things like the assist systems, the parking assist systems, drive mode, climate control, and then we have a physical button for the hazard lights. Lots of shiny black plastic going on in here. That's another controversial item, but something that we find in pretty much all of the competition. Under this section, we find two USB-C inputs and then a Qi wireless charging mat right over there. If I disconnect my phone, you'll see that there's just barely enough room for some of those larger smartphones right there. We then find a joystick-style shifter here. This is the engine start-stop button. Park is that button there. We then toggle this back for drive or sport, forward for reverse. Park is that button right there. And a nice touch is that you can actually just hit the power button and park the vehicle. It will do that automatically. Then there's the electric parking brake right there, two large cup holders, a little bit of another storage well right there in front of this padded center armrest, which is pretty deep and then features more USB charge ports inside. Somewhat unexpectedly, Volkswagen has decided to give all versions of the Atlas a full LCD instrument cluster. This is a touch I really appreciate because VW's LCD cluster is simply one of the best in the industry, and options like the Kia Telluride really make you work your way all the way up to the top trims in order to get the full LCD cluster, and the lower end trims end up looking a little bit cheesy as a result. Above this, we find a heads-up display. That's why we have that hole in the dashboard there. That's something obviously you aren't going to find in the base trim, but we do have in this particular SEL trim. Moving out from there, we find the Volkswagen steering wheel, sport grips up there, little paddle shifters on the back behind the steering wheel, controls for the adaptive cruise control over there on the left side, also volume up-down toggles, track forward-backward, that's over here on this side, as well as some controls for that multifunction LCD cluster. You can go through the options there, interact with the menus, etc. There's also a voice command button and a steering wheel heater button as well. To the left of the steering wheel, we find, you guessed it, even more touch controls, although thankfully Volkswagen does give us 4 window switches rather than just 2, like we've seen in some other recent Volkswagens. Now, going back up here to the dashboard, let's talk about this split air vent. This is something I really like more than I thought. It allows you to direct some air towards your head and move that around, and then some air towards your torso. It's an attractive and elegant solution to where does the air go out of the air vents. The reason I describe the 2-liter turbo as a controversial choice rather than a bad choice is that this is actually faster than the old V6. And if I come to a complete stop and romp on the throttle, we get a decent amount of low-end torque. That's because this is not the same 2-liter turbo that we found previously in the Atlas. This is a new revised 2-liter turbo with a different turbocharger, produces more power and more torque, and has a more advantageous horsepower and torque curve on it. You will really notice the difference, especially at low speeds where this doesn't have to downshift because the torque output is pretty healthy. Not as healthy as the 2.4-liter turbo in the Highlander or the Grand Highlander, mind you, but still very solid. And you'll also notice that when towing, not only is this a little quicker 0 to 60, but if you add extra weight in the vehicle or attach it to the back of the vehicle, it doesn't feel as burdened as some of the V6 competition can. And actually, a number of the V6 alternatives are going to be slower 0 to 60 than this 2-liter turbo model. So as far as I'm concerned, the engine is a non-issue, but it is controversial, and those output figures may just really scare a few people away. I kind of wish that Volkswagen had perhaps targeted slightly higher values just to help people feel better about their choice, but if you can get past that, I think you'll be just fine in the Atlas. The 6-0 stopping distance is also pretty decent, 118 feet in this model, and that's thanks to the relatively wide tires. This has 255 width tires on it. These are the middle width tire. There's also a 245 in the base model and 265 depending on the trim level you get. That has some more off-road oriented tires, so don't expect those 265 width tires to actually stop you that much shorter. The big thing you'll probably notice with the Atlas is that this just doesn't feel quite as nimble as some of the competition. The suspension is certainly tuned towards the softer side of things. We get a reasonable amount of body roll, a reasonable amount of tip and dive, and even though we have wide tires, it's not the grippiest entry in this segment. This is the kind of vehicle where you have to take it a little bit slower out on winding roads like this. You can't drive it quite as hard. Even if it was dry outside, you wouldn't be able to drive this quite as hard as a Honda Pilot or perhaps a regular Highlander. The Grand Highlander definitely feels big on the road. The regular Highlander feels a little bit more nimble, and it is notably smaller than either this or the Grand Highlander. At this point in time, I haven't driven the new Traverse or the new Acadia, but there are going to be versions of those vehicles with a torque vectoring axle in the back, like we find in the Pilot. Also know that this segment now includes 3 different rear-wheel drive entries. Well, actually, I guess you could say 4. We have the Durango and the Grand Cherokee. Those have been around for a while. But we also have the Ford Explorer and the Mazda CX-90. The CX-90 isn't the most nimble entry, but it certainly has a very different vibe than this Atlas. It certainly feels rear-wheel drive biased, it feels more dynamic out on the road, and you can get that turbocharged inline-6 engine, which is absolutely fantastic. The handling and the grip in the Atlas might not be my cup of tea, but the ride quality certainly is, whether we're talking about potholes out on this gravel road here, or the gravel road itself that has speed bumps and undulations, etc. The ride quality is excellent. That's the counterpoint to the softer suspension tuning in here. I have heard that some folks don't care for the ride quality in the Atlas. Honestly, I can't explain it. I don't know exactly what they're talking about, because that was a pretty decent bump back there in the Telluride, in the Grand Highlander, etc. Those bumps certainly come through into the cabin more than in the Atlas. This is exactly the kind of vehicle that if I wanted to take a longer road trip, I would certainly gravitate towards. This is going to be a lot easier to spend hours and hours and hours on a rougher road than some of the options that have more ground clearance. So as long as you don't absolutely need 8 inches of ground clearance, arguably this could get you further down that rougher trail at the national park, because you're just going to be more willing to spend time in it. It's not going to knock your teeth out. Gruff engine note aside, out on the road I measured 71 decibels at 50 miles an hour. If you dig deeper in the throttle, you definitely get that 4-cylinder sound in the cabin, but at typical highway speeds, you're probably not going to notice the engine at all. So when it comes to cabin noise, I'm going to give this an A-. You will find a few quieter entries out there, but this is pretty in keeping with the bulk of the segment. Fuel economy, unfortunately, that's also kind of in keeping with the bulk of the segment. Maybe I shouldn't complain about this because performance is pretty average, but fuel economy, I had expected a little bit better out of a smaller displacement engine. Over the week of driving, I've been averaging 18.5 miles per gallon. That's really no different than some of the 3.5 to 3.8 liter V6 engines that are available in this segment, or some of the more powerful turbocharged options as well. If you're looking for better fuel economy, there are definitely some options worth choosing. We have the CX-90 in base format. It is going to be a little bit more fuel efficient than this. And then of course we have the hybrids from Toyota, which are going to be fantastically fuel efficient in comparison. Those will really get you 35 to 38 miles per gallon in daily driving. That's a significant bump over the model that I'm driving right here, basically double.
When you look at the pricing ladder for the Atlas, you'll notice 2 things. Volkswagen has kept the price range pretty narrow, and they also don't have quite as many ways to configure your Atlas. So they've kept the configuration scheme relatively simple as well. You pick your trim level, you pick your color, and then there aren't too many options to select other than that. The pricing range will span from $39,420 up to $55,405 if you get carried away with all those option boxes. Compared against the competition, the top-end price is pretty similar to some of the very direct competitors that are about the same size and have about the same mission. Some of the hybrid options and some of the more off-road options, however, will definitely get more expensive. A Grand Highlander starts higher and also goes significantly higher, over $60,000. And that's not as expensive as a Grand Cherokee L will be, because you can get that puppy up to about $88,000. That's definitely much more expensive than the Atlas, although it certainly has a very different mission in mind. There are so many mid-size 3-row SUVs in this segment in America, we cannot possibly talk about them all. So for anybody that's feverishly typing down there in the comment section, but why didn't you include whatever? The reason is we just can't talk about it because we'd be here all day. Anyway, moving along, let's talk about the ones that I think most closely compete with the Volkswagen Atlas. And these would be the bigger, boxier, more family-friendly options. Clearly, we need to start with the Kia Telluride. It starts a little bit less expensive, $37,585, but keep in mind you're probably going to get a better discount on the Atlas than you will on a Telluride. Over the last few years, Telluride has been selling over MSRP, and even though that has quieted down, it seems to really be transacting right around MSRP lately. And you'll notice the average transaction price in the Atlas seems to be a little bit below MSRP, but they will get up to about the same price. Now, clearly, you might want to shop for the Atlas if you want a turbo engine. You might want to shop for the Telluride if you want a naturally aspirated V6. Also, you might want to check out the Telluride if you want the longer standard warranty that Kia offers, and generally speaking, higher reliability than we've found in the Volkswagen. When it comes to family friendliness, I would generally say that they're very evenly matched, with the exception of, again, those kids in forward-facing child seats. That tilt and slide mechanism makes the Atlas significantly more useful, in the window where your kids are able to use that feature. Now, your kids will age into and out of that feature over time, so you definitely need to keep that in mind, but I still think it's a definite good reason to buy the Atlas over the Telluride. The popularity of the Telluride has allowed Kia to offer a ton of different ways to configure it. Just check out the configurator. There seem to be an endless number of different trim levels, a huge list of standalone options, but oddly enough, the color palette is still a little limited on the Telluride side. As far as design goes, I think the win goes to the Atlas. I like the Telluride's look, but I actually like the look of the Atlas just a little bit better. And I think that the interior is really well done. I like the infotainment system in the Telluride a little bit more. The bigger two-screen setup is a little bit more intuitive, a little easier to use than the touch system that we find in the Atlas, but I don't think the Atlas's system is a disqualifier. Next up, we have the most compelling entry in this segment, at least for me, and the one that won our SUV of the Year award for 2024. That's the Grand Highlander, and specifically the regular hybrid Grand Highlander. Now, the Highlander itself spans from $43,320 up to $60,295, but the regular hybrid is actually going to be below that top-end price because the Hybrid Max system is the highest or most expensive option in the Grand Highlander, and that's the one that I would not get. If I were shopping for a Grand Highlander, I would skip the turbo engine, I would skip the top-end Hybrid Max, and I would just get the regular hybrid. You'll get over 30 miles per gallon very easily, performance that actually seems to beat the 2.4-liter turbo in most situations, and excellent reliability. Toyota's hybrid systems have long been the most reliable drivetrains in America. That's probably going to continue with the Grand Highlander. Now, even though you can't leave child seats latch anchored into place, you can slide that second row seat far enough forward that I can actually get into the third row thanks to the really square door opening and the fact that that seat does slide pretty far forward. We were able to sample that in the Grand Highlander. It definitely worked. The Grand Highlander also just has a huge amount of room inside, and if you want 8 seats, you can get it in that model. Now, getting your hands on a Grand Highlander, that could be a little bit tricky, although surprisingly, Toyota has been ramping up production of that Grand Highlander so rapidly that I fully expect it to outsell the Highlander in 2024. Moving along, we have another bestseller in this segment, the Ford Explorer. It starts at $38,455, so definitely starts a little bit less, goes up to about $63,004, so certainly more expensive than the Atlas. But you'll also get a twin-turbo V6 in that top-end trim. So if you want rear-wheel drive, you want more of a traditional four-wheel drive type system underneath the body, and you want turbocharged V6 engines, you can get all of that in the Explorer. But the Explorer doesn't feel quite as roomy or quite as family-friendly on the inside. Now, we are getting a new Explorer soon, so if you haven't seen that video, be sure and check that out, because by the time you're watching this video, I will already have seen the refreshed Explorer. It's not going to be everything that everybody was hoping for, but it actually is a pretty decent refresh. Moving along, we have the Honda Pilot. It starts around $38,000, goes up to $57,000 approximately, including some of the HPD packages that are installed at the factory. The Pilot is really an interesting option in this segment compared to the Atlas because it's a solid seller, but on the other hand, it doesn't have as many ways to configure it. So in that sense, it actually is a little bit like the Atlas. Honda really decided that they wanted to streamline the packaging and the pricing of the Pilot in this generation, and so they have really reduced the number of standalone options. One of the things I've always liked about the Pilot is that you can get a center seat in the second row in the top-end Elite trim. Not every version of the Pilot will be 8-seat from the factory, but most will. And as you work your way up the trim ladders in most of the competition, they start deleting that extra seat. On the other hand, the Pilot's third row is not as comfortable as many of the bigger SUVs that are available these days. Once upon a time, the Pilot was really known for being easy to park, but having a very roomy third row. The reality is that over time, the competition has moved on, and it's grown, especially something like that big new Grand Highlander. Meanwhile, the Pilot has remained about the same size on the inside. It has grown in this generation on the outside, but on the inside, it didn't really grow that much. Solid wins for the Pilot include the driving dynamics thanks to the torque vectoring axle. It basically has Acura's super handling all-wheel drive system on board. The V6 is fantastic, as is the 10-speed automatic transmission. I also think the exterior design is very well done. There's the more off-roady trail sport trim if you want something that is a little bit more aggressive off-road than the average, but not quite where we find the Jeep lineup. On the other hand, I do think that the interior comes across as a little bit old school. This has the latest in navigation and infotainment technologies from Honda, but it just doesn't feel quite as modern as some of the competition. If I were shopping in this segment and I was really looking for something that was very family-oriented, very roomy, easy to live with, etc., the Grand Highlander and the Atlas would probably be my top 2 picks. In some situations, the Atlas could be a little bit more convenient, but in others, I think the Grand Highlander actually narrows a very slight win. Depending on your exact situation, again, you can still get into the 3rd row in the Grand Highlander with those child seats installed in the 2nd row, and that's why my top pick still has to be the Grand Highlander. I do think the Atlas is absolutely excellent, and it's really well priced, definitely less expensive than certain versions of the Grand Highlander. It also is a little bit easier to park in some situations because of its slightly tighter dimensions, but I think the Grand Highlander has to win for me here. Let me know what you think about that, and let me know what your pick would be down there in the comment section below. Also, if you're shopping for an Atlas, what are you cross-shopping it against? Let me know that there as well. Find me over at Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of those social places. I'll see all of you next week.